So what started off as a feud between BC Indigenous groups and the provincial government over the Coastal GasLink pipeline has spilled over to become a national political crisis. Anti-pipeline demonstrators, of course, marched through the streets in cities from Vancouver, Winnipeg, and Ottawa, blocked major railway lines, which are still going on. Via Rail has shut down its entire network. CN closed its Eastern Rail network. All of this after the RCMP started arresting Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and their supporters for holding up that pipeline's construction. So should the demonstrators have the right to impact major aspects of the economy? What does it all mean for the future of natural resource projects? And who has true jurisdiction over this? Lots of questions here. The Scrum is here to find out more. Tonda McCharles is a senior reporter with the Toronto Star. Bob Fife, Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau chief. Our special guests this round are the chair of Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University, Pam Palmater's back, and the former press secretary to Stephen Harper, Sara MacIntyre is here. Good morning to all of you. Bob, let me just start with you on Mark Miller, who we had on the program. 9-hour meeting with the Mohawks in the Ontario. There's talks going on in BC. Still no real progress. Where does that put the government? What they have to do now?
Well, the Prime Minister's got to make a decision. Does he encourage, or because he says he's not going to involve with the police, but somehow send a signal? Do they arrest people, or do they start to continue to find a solution through talks? The problem he has is that this cannot go on for a long time. It's one thing to be able to have protests that do not disrupt the economy. But right now you have anti-pipeline blockades in eastern and central Ontario, in Ontario, that's shutting down the rail system and doing a lot of economic harm. He can't let that go on for much longer. It'd be even worse if this guy, the Prime Minister, decides to go to the Caribbean on Monday and Tuesday, because that would send a very bad message to the Canadians that he'd prefer to gallivant around the world and deal with a very serious problem.
The political perception problem for sure for this government is that there hasn't been since Thursday, 2 weeks ago, a sense of urgency around the whole issue. The passenger trains were halted Thursday, what, 11, 12 days ago now? So you haven't had a senior minister come out in the absence of the Prime Minister even talk to us about what's going on and what they're doing, what steps they're taking to resolve the issue at the heart of it in BC with the BC government. We've heard Premier Horgan step up, but Carolyn Bennett hasn't stepped up. When Mark Miller finally went before the cameras over the weekend, who could make any sense of what came of that meeting?
Yeah, let me just bring in Pam. Pam, so there was a meeting, 9 hours on the one blockade. There's meetings going on with the Wet'suwet'en in British Columbia. At some point, does the blockade have to lift, or what do you reckon the government's next move ought to be?
Well, first of all, they sent in the Indigenous Services Minister. That's the minister that takes care of programs and services, 100% unrelated to what it is that we're talking about here. And second of all, from all of the video at the actual site, none of the Mohawks are in breach of any injunction at all. If you see them, they're actually off the physical tracks. So we're talking about dealing with land. We're talking about dealing with, literally centuries of ongoing genocide, and there's an urgency to that. And they have been saying that every single flashpoint in this country that's ever happened, if you look at Oka or Elsipogtog, Gustafson Lake or Ipperwash, always over land. So this lies directly at the feet of the government. And the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau hasn't come down and had a nation-to-nation conversation about land and where we go forward on the land question, that lays at his feet. And so he's got to come and hold himself accountable and create this path forward. That's what leaders do. Right now, so far, the only leaders are the Canadians and Indigenous peoples standing in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en across the country.
Sara.
Yeah, I mean, the CN's put out statements to the contrary where they've seen protesters actually get on rail cars and they've been tampering with rail equipment, which they say they've witnessed and those types of things. So, whether or not, what do you determine? When is it an illegal protest where you actually have law enforcement actually go in and enforce an injunction? I mean, there's been injunctions that have been in place that are sitting at the feet of the OPP, and they're saying we're not getting involved. I mean, this is a legacy, as I think Pam has mentioned, from Ipperwash and Oka because, you know, it's going to be the law enforcement that's going to wear this, as opposed to the political leadership, which is, you know, gallivanting around and shaking hands with the Iranian foreign affairs minister. I think at the end of the day, for Canadians, and this is what Trudeau should be paying attention to, at what point are we going to be held hostage to demands that we don't really know specifically what those demands are? I mean, there has been 80% of people.
But there's a different thing going on here. Out in British Columbia, you've got democratically elected, all of the democratic elected bands in support of this Coastal Link pipeline. You have, in fact, some of the many members of the Wet'suwet'en people are saying, look, this is an opportunity for us to have jobs. If we don't have this pipeline, we're not going to have the kind of prosperity that we need. These are the people who are saying that themselves, democratically elected people saying this. This got environmental approval. It's got approval by the courts. And who is speaking for the majority of these native people? They're the ones who are saying this. We want this pipeline.
After extensive consultations, and I think this is like what is the line in the stand, other than let's have another round of nation-to-nation talks or a First Nations meeting again. To what end? What specifically is going to satisfy, and who are we looking to satisfy which demands?
And Pam, I want you to weigh in on that, but also in the midst of this, some of that, the idea of the frustration that we've seen was boiled over when we just played that clip of Andrew Scheer, who told the protesters to check your privilege, which had a massive blowback on it, certainly from many people. What was your reaction to that and that kind of frustration, which he says enforce the law, get these folks off the tracks?
Well, I mean, of course that's inflammatory. It's meant to be inflammatory. It's meant to cause division between Canadians and Indigenous peoples, because if you'll look across the country, there's quite a bit of solidarity with Canadians. You've got lawyers, academics, teachers unions, laborers, people who would actually be working on these projects but are standing in support of Indigenous peoples for these unresolved land issues. So him doing that is meant to inflame. It's meant to cause problems when everybody is forgetting about what the legal issues are. And band councils under the Indian Act have no jurisdiction over Aboriginal title territory, only the reserve lands, and that's not where the pipeline's going. In the Wet'suwet'en Nation particularly, only those hereditary leaders have jurisdiction to say yes or no over that territory, and they represent thousands of people who support them in their clans and houses, and they have said no.
Pam, actually, you'd probably find among Wet'suwet'en people who disagree with what you're stating is the consensus among them there. In fact, I think actually one of the I think Andrew Scheer's comments, they were offensive, and they're quite beside the point, and he's been beside the point in this whole debate this week. But one of the more promising developments that we've seen is that the Wet'suwet'en people have agreed to have an all-clans meeting, and they are bringing together their elected band council chiefs and the hereditary chiefs and the people, and so they restated
being against the pipeline. Did you see the statements after the feast by the hereditary leaders and people in the Wet'suwet'en? They have reconfirmed their opposition to the pipeline. So we need to focus on what they're saying and not what everybody else is saying.
All right, let me take a break, although there's clearly a split in communities across over this.